4 o'clock rock. Hawaii, the state of clean energy, here on Wednesday. Wednesday is Energy Day for sure. We like this show. This is one of our flagship shows. This is a show organized by Hawaii Energy Policy Forum, and we have an amazing sequence going on this spring. I need to tell you about that. We're doing LNG for 3 or 4 shows. Then we're doing transportation for 3 or 4 shows. And then we're going to do energy efficiency for 3 or 4 shows. You know, the whole spring is going to be all around these, these blocks of discussion around single subjects. And this is the first one. How exciting. To my immediate left, Richard Wallsgrove, Blue Planet Foundation. And to his left, Murray Clay, Ulupono Initiative. And to his left, John E. Cole, former PUC commissioner, and now a special person for HNEI, Hawaii Natural Energy Institute, which is connected with UH. Yes. Right. All right, and John is actually welcome to the show, all you guys.
Thanks, Jay.
Thank you. Thank you.
So John is actually going to frame the subject, but in general, the subject is 100% renewables hyphen. How do we get there? How do we get there by 2045? And the subtext is, what role does LNG play in all of that? So John, why don't you frame the various larger issues about it?
Sure, thanks Jay. Initially we know that we have a recently enacted law that requires we reach 100% electric generation or sales by 2045. So the question is, how do we get to there from here? Right now we burn quite a bit of fossil fuels to do that, and over time, as we're able to add more renewables, that amount should be declining. I brought a couple of slides. I don't know if you can put the first one up. It's just a pie chart that shows our current use of fuels in Hawaii. And as you can see, the 3 largest portions are for electricity production, air transportation, and ground transportation, and a few other smaller ones in there. But the RPS addresses only the electrical generation. We definitely still have to address transportation, which Jay said that'll be coming up in future episodes. But as well, there's bills before the legislature to also try to set some standards for reducing our fossil fuel use in the transportation sector. But today we're talking about the renewable electricity sector and how we get to 100% from where we are now. And I don't think anybody would argue that we're going to need fossil fuels for a while yet as we move in that direction. And LNG has been looked at and proposed for the last few years now. HNEI sponsored a study in late 2012 that showed there could be substantial savings. That was 3 years ago plus now, and the prices have changed quite a bit, but the basic conclusions behind it pretty much remain the same. If the differential between what you can bring the fuel in for and the price of the fuel you're replacing with it is large enough, it can save consumers money in the long run. So those things remain the same, but as we all know, the price of oil has dropped quite a bit. Today, I think it was around $30 per barrel, but the price of natural gas, at least on the Henry Hub index, has also declined, which is under $2 a million BTU today, from what I looked at.
Is that a comparative volume BTU, a million BTU versus a barrel of oil?
Price-wise, it's not. I think there's about 5.8 million BTUs in a barrel of oil.
Okay.
So you would multiply it by about 6, okay, the price for the million BTUs of natural gas, to get on a comparative basis. But today what we want to look at is how we're going to get from where we are today and what we're burning, and if there's a way we can, if LNG or some other thing can be done to get us to 100%. And we know the volumes will be declining, but one of the major things I think about is, can we save some consumers money as we're moving toward renewables, which is going to require a large amount of investment in the renewable generation infrastructure, if we need storage, all of that type of thing, grid upgrades and other things. So we're looking at how we can save some money and make those investments at the same time.
Can I ask you a question that just occurs to me right now? Can we do this both at the same time? I mean, is this the way this is shaping up? a track where you have both things happening at the same time? In other words, the building of infrastructure, grid infrastructure and the like, for a pure renewable ultimate, goal, and also building infrastructure for LNG. Do those things happen at the same time or in sequence?
I think at the same time, definitely. It depends on the LNG, how you bring it in and how much infrastructure you need. The latest from Hawaii Gas and what they're looking at with their bids they went out for, and I guess they accepted one and are working with one particular bidder now, is it would come in the same way as crude oil does today and offload be regasified and offloaded into a mooring point out in the ocean and come through a pipe to shore. And I think the shore infrastructure, there's some smaller things, but the major piece would be like an 8-mile pipeline or something. So if the cost differential is enough to pay for that and bring in savings, I think it should be something that should be considered for ratepayers and who's footing the bill for everything, compared to continuing with oil or even moving to something like biofuel, which could be a lot more expensive, at least today's prices.
Okay.
So,
okay.
And to get to Richard and Murray, I just want to say that I know Murray has worked on looking at price volatility, and he's done some Monte Carlo simulations, which I'll let him explain. But he's been looking at how, LNG might be able to be a little less volatile and therefore have a little less risk than, the oil cost over looking at the last several years anyway, the volatility of both. But I'll let you explain that a little more, Murray, what you've done and what you've
So Murray,
seen
you gave this Monte Carlo presentation, what was it, at Energy Day last summer. It was very valuable. And before you go into, the way you did it and what you concluded, can you tell us what assumptions you made, in order to use this Monte Carlo model? And Monte Carlo, it's not gambling. It's a way of calculating comparative costs. I don't know if that's right.
Richard might argue that using fossil fuels is gambling.
Okay.
So it comes from the same idea. It's trying to forecast probabilities. So you look at how volatile, how much something has moved around in the past, and you say, well, if this, in the case of the work that I did, I looked at the last 15 years of oil and gas prices, saw how much they moved around, and say if that is kind of representative of how much they can move up and down, small amounts, big amounts in the future, and you project that out over time, you're pulling all these sort of random price lines out of this volatility distribution, which is just a way of saying if it can move around a lot like it did in the past, and we project those probabilities in the future, what could it look like? So all it's talking about, instead of just plotting some average fuel cost line, it shows how much it could vary over time, and based on this wide distribution of prices, what could that do to us financially? Could it really hurt us? Could it help us? How good or bad could that get? And it's just a way of modeling that type of thing.
I know you have your Monte Carlo analysis, but I like to throw one thing in at the beginning rather than at the end, and that is nobody predicted what was going to happen to oil not 60 days ago.
Exactly.
And that is a new wrinkle in world history, really, and certainly world economic history. Doesn't that sort of undermine predictions or predictive analysis going forward to find this fabulous, remarkable, incredible, unpredictable thing happening? Does that change your way of doing the Monte Carlo?
That's why I wanted to do the Monte Carlo, exactly for that reason, because people were relying, I think, in other presentations we'd see in these conferences and stuff, they'd take Department of Energy predictions, they'd take various investment banks predictions of what oil and gas and coal and these different things would be in the future. They plot that single line, that single price forecast, and they say, oh, look, it's better, it's cheaper, it's, whatever. And they don't realize that not only did no one forecast this huge drop in prices, but no one forecasted, obviously, the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And if you go back to these federal Energy Information Administration or agency, I always forget, price forecasts they do every year. The one they did back in the year 2000, and they project out about 30 years, we got, after that, the Japanese nuclear disaster, we got to 3.8 times their high forecasted price. They forecast low, medium, and high. We were almost 4 times the high price. So those forecasts and predictions aren't really worth much, although I will say that the folks that make them all collectively know far more about oil and gas than I do. So I took this from a point of, I can't forecast any of this. I can't forecast any of these prices. So what I want to do is just say, look, it moved a lot in the past, and this past 15 years had macroeconomic issues that came up, which is kind of what we experienced just recently, supply-demand issues that came up, very specific disasters like the nuclear disaster came up, multiple economic cycles. So all these kind of weird variants happened in the past. So maybe that kind of stuff can happen in the future, and project that out and use that to say, we can't say if something's definitely better or definitely worse. All we can talk about is probabilities that it's better or worse.
Okay. So how confident can we be of the Monte Carlo analysis you're now going to tell us about?
If you're looking for an exact answer, not super confident. If you're looking for general probabilities of how happy or sad you could be in the future based on a choice you make now, then it's actually pretty good.
Yeah, then that's what we should do then. So what is your analysis, and what are your conclusions?
So looking at an assumption that we spend the next 5 years trying to bring a new fuel to Hawaii, whether it's LNG or just an oil diesel mix, because one thing we should keep in mind is sticking with the present fuel mix is actually not an option. With the MATS, it's mercury air toxic standards regulations that are coming out. We're going to either have to start blending diesel with the oil to meet those air standards. Some people suggest it could be 75 oil, 25% diesel, or even more diesel, and diesel tends to be more expensive. So
is that biodiesel or
just diesel,
conventional
just diesel, because they're worried about making the federal standards. So we're either going to have to blend more expensive diesel into the oil, which will raise the price of the fuel even more, or we're going to have to switch to something else that will meet those air standards as they are, which would be possibly LNG. So without any desire to predict anything, I just wanted to see how good or bad it could be. And it did look like, using analysis where it takes you 5 years to switch, and then you hold that new fossil fuel for 15 years. Keep in mind, we do have our renewable energy goals, so that should be dropping off over time. So I looked at that 15-year horizon of being on that new fuel and what those savings could end up being. And it looked like if running the Monte Carlo simulation looked like it would be about $2.6 billion on average. But again, that's an average. So about 80 to 85% of the time you save money with LNG versus oil and diesel. The other 15 or 20% of the time you're actually worse off with LNG versus oil and diesel. So again, it's not an absolute win one way or the other. You just talk about probabilities, and the probabilities do look like LNG would save you money versus oil and diesel.
$2.6
billion
over 5 years or each year?
Over 15 years. That's a
15
total
years.
over 15 years.
Okay.
Yeah. So in fact, and knowing that these numbers, millions and billions, sound very big to people, which they do, but you don't know what it means to you, I tried to break that down based on a 600 kilowatt hour bill, so thinking about just our own bills. And that savings could amount to be about, over that 15 years, you got 12 monthly bills, so divide by 15, divide by 12, it ends up being about 28 to 30 bucks a person per month on average. So it's a huge number, but when you take it down to the individual person's bill, call it 28 to 30 bucks a month on average over 15 years.
And
Now,
that's every person in the household, not just by household.
No, that's
by
the
individual
600 kilowatt hour bill.
Per bill.
So it's
Oh,
for that
bill.
bill,
Okay.
for that,
All right.
that ratepayer.
Okay.
Yeah.
All
Yeah,
right.
not per person, not per capita.
Okay. Well, that's a lot of money.
It is.
But, if I have a bill that's $300, let's see, what are we talking about? 20%?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay there.
Oh, it's 300 bucks, it'd like be 10%.
10%, yeah.
28, 30 bucks, yeah.
All right. Well, that's pretty good. It's in favor of that. Then I guess we're going to go to a break first, but I'd just like to ask Richard, how much of that analysis does he accept and agree with? And what else would he add on to that analysis? And what assumptions, if you will, would he agree with or not? Okay. I can't hardly wait. What do you have to say? We'll take a short break. We're going to wind up. This is cliffhanger, Okay, that John Cole, Murray Clay, Richard Wallsgrove, and me. We'll be right back after this break.
Aloha, namaskar, and hello. My name is Anu Hittel, and I host the show called Climate Change Beyond Outrage. We go beyond outrage to find solutions to climate problems facing people, nations, and the world. I hope you will join me here every Tuesday at 1 o'clock. We broadcast live from thinktechhawaii.com. Aloha and bye-bye.
Hi, I'm Stan the Energy Man, Stan Osterman, and I'm here to tell you about my show on Friday, every Friday, on my lunch hour, 12 o'clock till 1 o'clock here on Think Tech Hawaii. We talk about everything energy and anything you ever wanted to know about energy. So we're full of energy, and we'll see you here every Friday at noon to 1. Aloha. We're back, we're live, we're here in Hawaii, the state of clean energy, talking about 100% renewable. How do we get there, and what role will LNG play? Okay, Richard. So the cliffhanger question was, how much of what Murray said do you agree with or not?
So the answer to that is easy. I agree with everything that Murray said. I think that
Murray, you ought to feel good now.
I bribed him before we came in here.
What Murray's doing here is incredibly important because it's recognizing the fundamental truth that we are really bad at predicting things. We talked about a couple of examples, but let's look at some more. A couple of years ago, actually, HNEI did their study of liquefied natural gas, and there's a line in that study that says, you know, we can see the price of oil coming down maybe to $70 or $80 a barrel, but it won't come any lower. Here we are at 30. 2008, the state doubled down on renewable energy, set some really aggressive goals, and said maybe we can get about 25 megawatts of rooftop solar over the course of the next decade. Well, we beat that by a factor of 10. So we're really bad at predicting the future, but it's easy enough to see the trends here. I mean, the trends in general, if we look over a long enough time period, are fossil fuels get more expensive because it's a finite resource, and renewable energy, the technologies get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. How do we kind of put all that into a bucket and analyze it appropriately? I think that's what Murray is doing. And perhaps, I mean, one thing I think we have to say about Murray's analysis, and I took this from a paper or an article that Murray and John wrote together, so I know it's right, is that when you do the same thing for renewable energy, you actually find out you get that same sort of value. I mean, the benefit of many types of renewable energy is that the price will be steady or known for the future. And so that makes Murray's job a lot easier in terms of forecasting what the benefits that are. And there's a value to that. There's an insurance value to that is part of what Murray's calculating. So I think it's really important that we do this type of analysis as opposed to well, I think oil will be $70 a barrel in the future.
Absolutely, yeah.
While I think it's a valuable analysis, I think that the question in this show wasn't LNG yay or nay, it was how do we get to 100% renewable energy?
Right.
And I think that the LNG question is the last question to answer there. The first thing we have to think about is what do we need the energy for? What are we using? We've always in the past focused on the generation side. We make lots of energy. Coal was cheap, oil was cheap. We make lots of energy, we use it whenever we need it. Well, now energy is not so cheap. And so let's look at the demand side. How do we shrink how much energy we need? How do we change when we need it? And I can run my dishwasher, set the timer so it goes on at noon. I know there's lots of solar energy available at noon. So I think if we focus
you have a dishwasher like that?
I have a dishwasher like that. It's got a 4-hour delay button.
Okay.
So if we start with this demand side, we can actually make big changes in our renewable energy costs.
How about looking at a graphic to highlight the demand? Okay.
Sure. So there we have the how much fossil fuels we might need over time. That's declining. That's a really steady trend. What if we shrunk that even further? What if we shrunk it down much, much further? Or better yet, what if we didn't shrink it, but what if we started to use some of that energy for electric vehicles rather than using it for heating water? There's a professor at the University of Hawaii. His name is Matthias Fripp.
We've had him. He sat in that chair.
He's like Murray. He's one of these really smart guys who I listen to.
He's incredible. He's just like Murray.
Done the same sort of calculations that Murray's doing, and he looked at what happens if we squeeze a whole bunch of electric vehicles on the grid, and lo and behold, everybody's energy prices come down. And I think they come down, I mean, we're talking orders of magnitude here, I think they come down on the same scale as Murray's talking about. So I think we could achieve these savings before we even get to this question of LNG. We shrink how much we need, we get smarter about when we need to use it. Then as we're planning this transition to 2045, we might find we don't have to make these huge investments we're talking about. I've been a little bit disconcerted recently with some of the talk about LNG because we're doing these price forecasts and saying it's going to be not Murray's analysis, but other analyses. It's going to be wonderful, it'll save people money. And they've left out some important pieces of information. They've assumed, for example, that it'll take about $200 million or so to build the pipelines and the other equipment we need. They've left out the fact that we also have to spend another 100 million or 200 million to change the power plants to burn the LNG. They've left out what we learned yesterday, or 2 days ago, I guess, in a filing by Hawaiian Electric Company. Part of the plan is to build a whole new power plant which could burn LNG. That's $700 million. So I sort of feel like if we went down the ledger and added up all these costs, we could probably use up that 2.6 billion pretty quick. On the other hand, the graph we saw a minute ago with the declining oil trend, if we imagine how much money is left in the part of that graph we're not using, above the line, that's the fuel we're no longer using. So I did a rough analysis, not as good as Murray's, about sort of how much are we saving on fossil fuels between now and 100% renewable energy. It's about $30 billion we won't be spending on fossil fuels.
And does that take LNG into account or not?
That assumes that we pay for fossil fuels roughly what we've paid over the past decade.
Okay.
I don't know if that assumption is valid or not. I think Murray's analysis could give us a much finer point.
Okay.
Nonetheless, you're going to find tens of billions of dollars in fossil fuel savings. That's what we use to rejigger our system so we can use more renewable energy. Then we get the added benefits that we're not screwing up the environment. LNG is definitely not on the friendly environmental front. So we're not screwing up the environment. We know what that renewable energy will cost. And we're achieving our state's policy goals. We're using local resources to do it. I think it's just a win-win-win all the way down. If we make that plan, we commit to it, we get all the details right, we follow Professor Fripp's model, I think we would find that this need for LNG shrinks, which changes the economics pretty dramatically. I think that then you'll find that people get a little bit honest about the long-term plan for LNG. I don't think we really plan to import it and then give it up in 15 years. We're not going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to do that. I think that the idea would be to shift that into transportation. And that runs at odds with doing things like electrified transportation or using locally grown biofuels for transportation. So I think there's a whole host of problems with the LNG plan the way it's currently set out.
So your plan would be without LNG?
I think the governor is right that it takes our eye off the ball. I can't say that once we've maybe laid the groundwork for this transition in the way that the people like Professor Fripp have suggested, I can't say that maybe in a decade time or 8 years time, we might go, okay, there's a little bit of fossil fuels left. We have a better idea of exactly how much we need. And at that point, it might make sense to switch it. The amount of capital costs to bring it in these large volumes to me seems like it really wouldn't work under that scenario, so I think it's unlikely, but I'm open to it. I recognize we don't turn off the fossil fuel spigot tomorrow. I'd like to see us do it as fast as we can.
So you're talking about changing the plan. I mean, in your perception of this, so you go down a little bit, you change, you see how things, you see predictions come true or not. You go down a little way and then you adjust the plan. And so your whole planning, well, what do you plan now if you do that? What do you plan right now?
It seems to me that there are two concepts missing from our current energy system that we probably should start on sooner rather than later. The first is energy storage. There's some folks on the Big Island, some folks on Kauai that are looking at pumped hydro as a way to store energy. It seems like those are big capital projects the same way that LNG is a big capital project. That's the kind of thing we should start today if we want to have it in a decade's time. And the second thing is a concept called demand response. And this is the idea that rather than turning the dial up and down on the generation side, we could turn the dial up and down on the demand side. Automating that, making it part of just how the whole network operates. I think we have to start on that today. I think that's our highest planning need in terms of a big gap for the future, including electric vehicles. It's part of that demand response solution.
Okay, Murray. I take it you agree with everything that Richard said, just the way that he agreed with everything that you said.
Yeah, if you're looking for a fight, you're going to have a hard time starting one here today. Yeah, so there's a couple things he said that I want to jump on board with. So on the decrease in demand over time, that's a really important principle with looking at LNG. If we are going to even be open to the possibility of LNG, I think pretty much everyone wants to be assured that we won't lock ourselves into some sort of volume or an amount of capital improvement projects that will require us to keep using it beyond when we should or use more than we should. So we want, Richard hit the nail right on the head, that the cheapest form of renewable energy is energy efficiency. It's cheaper than solar, wind, everything. The energy that you don't use is the cheapest way to reduce fossil fuel use.
Yeah.
So whether we have a reduction in demand from energy efficiency or from solar and wind and geothermal coming up, either way, you don't want to be locked into a situation where you have to burn LNG because of a contract or because of the amount of capital that you've got to recover through the ratepayer. You don't want to be locked into that. So I think a lot of the concern that people have is not even necessarily just LNG versus oil. I mean, I think most people agree that LNG, some people would disagree, but I think most people would agree that LNG does burn at least cleaner than oil in terms of emissions. And so on that standpoint, it's attractive, but people are concerned, suspicious, whatever word you want to use, that we'll get locked into something that's too much and doesn't allow us to increase the renewables or decrease, increase the efficiency, decrease the demand at the rate that we could otherwise do. So whatever kind of financial modeling we do, that's something I try to do with this analysis, is to make sure that I don't just assume that all of the oil generation flips over to LNG, because then you're assuming that you're just replacing one fossil fuel in a semi-permanent basis with something else. So the idea is when you're taking things like that, they call it an FSRU, floating storage and regasification, the big boat that sits offshore and takes the natural gas and regasifies it, that cost of renting that, the cost of the undersea pipeline that you talked about, the cost of the onshore pipelines and different things, the cost of converting those power plants over. You've got to make sure that when you're figuring those costs in, you're sort of dividing that over the right number of units of gas, and that should be a declining number of units of gas over time, which will make it seem relatively more expensive, because you're sort of being honest about renewable energy should be coming up, gas should be coming down, so you should be having to force yourself in your analysis to recover that cost over fewer BTUs, units of
So
the gas.
how do you assure the people who express concern that, from a political point of view, it's hard to give it up after you've built infrastructure, to set it up? What do you say to them?
Part of it is to do the analysis right in the first place, which is why we started on this project. In fact, just as a quick aside, I had someone kind of joke with me. They didn't realize I worked for the gas company because the work I did seemed positive towards gas. But the point was to do the analysis right and to make sure that if you're going to look at savings, you look at it with the lower volumes of LNG, because the more capital you spend, the more gas you're going to have to bring in to recover those costs over time, or it's not going to make sense.
But you can spend capital on infrastructure that's relatively short term. I mean, like that boat processor offshore.
That can sail away when
that
you're
would be a
done.
lot cheaper than building a big thing
Certainly.
onshore. And I'm hoping that there's fewer environmental problems in setting it up offshore than onshore. I don't know the answer to that, but because that takes time.
Yeah.
So going to the question though that I asked Richard is a short-term plan and then a long-term plan. So given your analysis and the whole timeline and predictability of things, what do you think should be the short-term plan? What we do first right now, and what room would you leave for the tuning of that into a long-term plan?
Well, as I think both John and Richard said, we have to do a lot of things at the same time, which is the problem. If we want to get to 100%, we have to do a lot at the same time. We have to be going full throttle on energy efficiency, on demand response, on solar, wind, geothermal, biofuels, everything. We need all those renewable sources. We have to be going full speed ahead on those, as well as energy storage, smart grid, all these things. So that's the hard part, is a lot of things you have to do at the same time. We do have to figure out, and I think we're going to find out, if I'm not too out of date on my news, fairly quickly, about whether or not, I think the governor asked for another extension, another waiver, I guess, of the MATS standards. I don't know if that answer has come back yet or not, so I might be a tad out of date on that. But if we get another waiver, then we can continue with oil and don't have to switch to that oil diesel blend, which will be more expensive. That solves an immediate problem. If he does not get that waiver, then we either need to make that switch or switch to something else that's going to be clean. So that will force the immediacy of, do I have to go oil diesel or do I go LNG, or what am I going to do to make these regulations work for us? So I'm not sure that we have that answer right now, but that's something that will have to be figured out pretty quickly. I think on the positive side, the gas company has been pretty transparent about the proposals for pricing that they've received and the amount of capital they're assuming would have to be spent on infrastructure. I think if we want to look at that, I know the governor said he doesn't want to consider LNG. If we are going to look at it, we need to make sure that, in fact, those volumes can decline without penalty over time, that based on our renewable energy goals, those curves intersect properly, right? As the as the renewable energy comes up, the gas comes down, and yet recovering the costs of those fixed assets over that fixed period of time, over dwindling amounts of natural gas, if all that is done properly and sort of locked in, whether it's by some sort of rate agreement in the future, that's a way to say, if we're going to look at it, let's look at it carefully and make sure that we have sort of guarantees built into the system where it can't be, whoops, I'm sorry, we actually need to keep importing gas to pay for these assets that we built.
So what useful life, if I can use that term here, would you want to assign to depreciating and amortizing the cost of the infrastructure for the LNG?
Well, I think 15 years is not, so first of all, the usable life of the assets is far beyond 15
Yes.
years. But the point is you want to make sure you have your costs fully recovered over the more limited time that you want to be using natural gas before you get onto 100% renewables.
Right.
So 15 years seems like a reasonable amount of time by which you should have most of your renewable energy coming online and the gas offline. So we should pay a lot of attention to the calculations that are made to make sure that we're not trying to recover the value of these fixed assets
Over too long a period.
over too long of a time.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
exactly.
But it does make it kind of attractive that if you've recouped them all in 15 years, now you've recouped them. Now you still have the assets in place, right? So you can continue to use them. That'd be politically attractive, wouldn't it?
Well, they only get, as I understand it, and we're kind of crossing lines a little bit here because we're talking about importing natural gas and using the formula from the gas company versus the electric utility, which has this rate cases they have to go through. But as I understand it, they get a return or a potential return off of their assets, and once an asset is fully depreciated, I don't believe they get a return on that anymore. So
Oh, I see.
the positive side is if you've fully depreciated or fully recovered the value of that asset, you don't get to keep collecting money on it.
Okay. We're going to take a short break so we can digest all of this and give John a chance to respond. And he can say whether he agrees with Murray or Richard or not. We take a short break. This is Jay Fidel. We have John Cole, Murray Clay, Richard Wallsgrove here in Hawaii, the state of clean energy, talking about how do we get to 100% by 2045, and what role does LNG play? We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Ethan Allen, host of Likeable Science on Think Tech Hawaii. Come join us every Friday at 2 p.m. when I interview interesting scientists about what they do, why they do it, and why we should all care about it. It's a lot of fun to see. And you can learn interesting stuff. You'll hear all kinds of fascinating science, and we know you'll have a great time. Hope to see you then. Bye-bye.
Aloha, my name is Kirsten Baumgart-Turner, and I'm the host of Sustainable Hawaii at thinktechhawaii.com. We air live on the internet and also on Oceanic Channel 16. I'd invite you to come for a fresh new show every Tuesday from 12 to 1 o'clock. I try to bring on guests that give us a different viewpoint on aspects of sustainability in Hawaii, as well as trying to unpack some of the difficult concepts of measuring and achieving sustainability, particularly with regard to sustainable economic growth and prosperity in Hawaii. Please join us every Tuesday from 12 to 1 p.m. Mahalo, aloha.
Bingo, we're back. 4 o'clock rock, Hawaii, the state of clean energy. John Cole, Murray Clay, Richard Wallsgrove, talking about what role does LNG play in getting to 2045 with 100% renewables. Incidentally, do you know how we figured out the 2045 part? Did anybody Murray, did you make an analysis on that? Did you make a timeline?
I understand it was a compromise between 2040 and 2050.
It's a legislative
I think
compromise.
that's all it
I'm
was.
sure there were good reasons for all of that.
It turns out if you draw a straight line through our fossil fuel consumption over the past decade or so,
Yeah.
and project it out as far as you can,
Yeah.
it gets to zero at
It's
about
kind of like that
2045.
graph we just
So,
set
yeah.
up there.
Okay.
Accidentally, it sort of works, although,
Okay.
I was on the 2040 side of that debate.
All right. At least there was a debate about it. Okay, let's see. Now, you had a comment. Wait, one of you guys, Richard, you had a comment you wanted to make before John spoke. Okay.
You asked Murray, what can we do to be sure about, for the people who are concerned that this isn't just a transitional plan, how can we be sure?
Yeah.
And I think there are actually some answers to that question. We have a law that says our electricity has to transition to renewables. We don't have any law that says our gas has to transition to renewable gas. I would love to see that sort of policy in place. It would give us the certainty that both sectors are on the same track. It would actually be fair for the two sectors as well. That would, I think, give us some comfort that we're not talking about importing LNG and then just moving it from electricity into transportation. And it would force our gas company to come up with a business plan, a long-term sustainable business plan that maybe involves using renewable natural gas that comes off of landfills or uses hydrogen that we can make from all the extra solar and wind power we have. So I think there are policies in place, but without those policies, the question is, how can we be sure? I don't think we can.
Well, don't you think, I mean, it's pretty sort of conclusory when we say 100% by 2045. C'est ça, c'est tout, that's it. There's nothing in the statute that tells you how to get there. That's why we're having this conversation. So I asked you before about, a short-term plan, maybe a long-term plan. Do we need to codify that? Do we need to build that into, another statute? How do we make a plan that everybody will, A, live with, and B, live with?
I think the good news is the Public Utilities Commission is doing a terrific job of really providing a vision for how we get that plan done. So it's happening for the electricity sector. I can't say it's happened at all. We're at the starting point with no progress on the gas side of that equation.
Yeah.
You
You got a comment too.
No, I mean natural gas.
Natural gas.
Yeah.
Although gasoline's in the
Yeah.
should be in the same
Care
bucket.
about that too, yep.
All right.
So Richard said something a little while ago that I wanted to jump on board with as well, which is he used the word insurance. And we think about really renewable energy as insurance. And if you think about it, human beings, well, people in America certainly, have insurance for pretty much everything. We've got health insurance, car insurance. If you're a homeowner, you've got homeowner's insurance, you got life insurance, you got every major financial shock that you could endure as a person, you have generally some sort of insurance to protect you against it. And yet 100% of the fuel cost risk is borne by the ratepayer. There is currently no insurance other than renewable energy.
Against volatility.
Against
You're talking
volatility,
insurance
yes.
against volatility.
Yeah, so people are okay with, once they know what something costs, you have a nice stable bill, people can budget around that. Commercial properties budget around it. People, you can budget around your whatever $100 a month health insurance payment you've got to pay. And you'd rather pay that monthly premium than have this skyrocketing healthcare costs, and maybe you're healthy for a while, then nothing, and then you get sick and it goes really bad. And people don't want to do that. They want to have a nice fixed cost they can plan for, they can build their life around, and they can expect to not have surprises. So renewable energy does that for ratepayers in terms of energy. Now, the fixed cost nature of renewables isn't news to anyone. Everyone knows about that. But the question then is, what does that insurance cost? What's the cost of that insurance premium, if you will? Or said another way, using this Monte Carlo analysis, even if you use a really hard target like LNG in terms of a financial target to beat, what is the insurance value of renewables? And so if you solve that, there's sort of good news and bad news. The good news was a year ago when I did this analysis for the first time, that break-even point for renewables was about 14 cents per kilowatt hour. And the really interesting thing about that is just by happenstance, kind of like you're saying with the 2045 thing, just by happenstance, those waiver projects were coming through at about 14 cents per kilowatt hour. So right at the time those 14-cent projects were coming through, the break-even said, hey, if you can get renewables for 14 cents per kilowatt hour cheaper, just get as many of those as you possibly can.
Yeah,
Just
I'll
load
take
up.
14 cents.
Exactly,
yeah.
I would too. And so that's the good news. The somewhat bad news, but still there's a happy end of the story, is that now with the lower oil costs, that's dropped about 10.5 cents. So that's pretty hard. Renewables aren't there yet, except for maybe potentially geothermal, but and energy efficiency, of course. So 10.5 cents is tough to beat, but when I say insurance value or the insurance price, that's the break-even point. And what I mean by that is it's the probability of being worse off financially or being better off financially is about the same. It doesn't mean the magnitude is the same. So with renewables, for example, if you're able to get renewables at 10.5 cents per kilowatt hour, even with the comparison being cheap natural gas, if you look at the probabilities, the 10% lowest gas prices, so the time when you're sort of regretting, if you will, financially that you got renewables, that 10% lowest, you'd lose about $3,200 of your money over 15 years of paying your bills. At the 10% highest natural gas prices over these simulations, sorry, I said that the wrong way. It's $1,138 that you lose if gas goes up. Sorry, let me get this straight. $1,138 is what you basically pay too much if you have renewables and gas is low, versus if gas is really high, it can save you the $3,200. So what that means is even though the probability of losing money is about the same, you're about 3 times better off when things get extreme. Does that make sense? I kind of stumbled with the numbers, but about 3 times more money to be saved with renewables than sort of lost if natural gas stays low for a long time.
Yeah.
So even though the probabilities are the same, the magnitude of your savings or costs is very different.
What I get out of this, I mean, there's plenty in there, what you just said, but what I get out of this is that beyond being a bridge, in your analysis, LNG is insurance. It's a stabilizing.
No, the renewables are the insurance. So renewables is a fixed price. So it's like paying your healthcare premium. You pay whatever it is, so many $100 a month you pay every month. And that protects you from this, right? So if you have renewable energy, the more renewable energy you have, the more fixed your prices become. And so when we're doing this analysis, you look at the highest natural gas prices and the lowest natural gas prices, and you see how much you could save by being on renewables versus it would cost you if natural gas was very low. And renewable energy is the insurance.
Renewables are not volatile.
No, they're usually
There's
fixed price.
no supply issue.
Sometimes
there.
there's a very small annual accelerator, and they're basically fixed price.
Yeah, I see.
And that's the other thing to point out is people talk about LNG as being less risky. It's actually not. So the volatility is there. Oil has volatility, natural gas has volatility. The volatility is still there. It's currently lower priced. And because it's currently lower priced, people think that means less risky, and it doesn't mean that. It just means that right now it's lower priced. When you look at the volatility, again, you could be 3 times worse off on the extreme ends than you are better off with switching to LNG versus renewables.
Okay, John, you ready to comment?
Hopefully that made sense.
Go for it.
I agree with everything that was said. I don't fully understand everything Murray just explained, except that the fixed cost of renewables can be an insurance against the volatility
Exactly.
of natural gas or oil or
No,
whatever
I get
other
it when
fuel
you
is
explained it. I
volatile.
get it, finally.
And I definitely agree with Richard on some of the things we need to do that we haven't been doing, particularly demand response and looking at storage. I don't necessarily think, at least initially, it's going to be cost effective. I mean, there's savings from not using fuel, but I don't think it's going to be enough initially to cover some of those differences. But there's definitely a lot of work that can be done in both efficiency and demand response. We've been doing pretty well with efficiency. There's a lot more we can do. But with demand response, there's been talk about doing a lot better programs for a long time, and they just haven't materialized in this state. And I think a lot of that has been, rate design and it not being there to incentivize a market like demand response, or even now with distributed resources like rooftop PV and storage. A good rate design could do a lot to help the market move things rather than forcing a utility or a regulator to do that. So I think that's all very important. And as far as LNG, I think if you can have some confidence in the probability of prices, and you can save consumer prices or money as we're moving through this transition to where we all want to go, and ensure that the supply is for a limited time, the infrastructure is recovered over a limited time, I don't see a reason to take that off the table. I mean, it's something that I think should be considered along with everything else, because it's a huge job getting to where we want to go.
I'll ask you the same question I asked Richard. What's in the immediate plan as opposed to the long-term plan?
I think go for the most cost-effective solutions you can and keep moving us, on the trajectory to get where we want to go. With that being efficiency, demand response, and looking at fuels. I mean, if you can save consumers money along the way, because there's going to be a lot of investment that's necessary in the renewable generation itself and all the things it's going to take to integrate that into a system, whether it's grid upgrades or storage or all the other things that are going to have to happen.
Very valuable comments from all three of you, but I have one more question, which is it's an interesting question actually. So we have two organizations that are both in favor, trying to advance the idea of LNG. We have Hawaii Gas, which is, I think, further along down the pike to make a plan to make it work, to bring all the elements together and have it happen. And we have Hawaiian Electric, who also would like to see LNG. So you've all given your analyses, your views of various aspects of this. But are you assuming that one or the other or both, would lead the charge on LNG when you make your statements? And would you change your statement if I said, well, only Hawaii Gas is going to do it, or only Hawaiian Electric is going to do it, or they're both going to do it in certain parts and pieces? Where does that enter into your analysis, Richard?
I haven't made any assumptions about one or the other. I think that the important thing is that it's a transparent debate. I get really concerned when I see folks at these entities say that LNG is just cleaner. Murray was much more accurate when he says it burns cleaner. It turns out LNG can be terrible from a greenhouse gas perspective. It can be as bad as things like coal. So if we have transparency, I think that question of who will resolve itself, and that really when we're thinking about what does it mean for consumers, what does it mean for our environment, what does it mean for our transition, that the who is not really as important as the what.
Because you're nodding your head, I'm getting the idea that
It's
you
well
might
said.
agree.
Yeah, I made no assumptions about who owns it. That's beyond the financial analysis that I did. The point is the transparent debate. Really look at how the rates, the amount's going to be recovered back over what period of time, what volumes. What if we have a breakthrough in renewables and we have some technological advancement or some price drop in renewables and we want to increase renewables even faster? Does the contract allow for that reduction in gas? I mean, just as long as we're very clear about that, just as Richard said, I think the debate should be healthy.
Actually, Murray, we've been talking about LNG. I don't know if you'd call it a debate, but we've been having something close to a debate about LNG. Yes, no, maybe, when, what, how much, who.
Yeah.
For probably, I would just take a wild guess and say 4 years now.
Yeah.
Yep.
When do we have the debate you're talking about, you both are talking about, and when is that debate over and made into some kind of decision, some policy decision?
After we get our energy efficiency and energy storage and demand response house in order is my answer to that question.
I knew he'd say that. Murray, what about you?
It's a pretty good answer, and it's one of the reasons why also with, although I know it's not the topic of this discussion, why with the next era HECO mergers discussions and ongoing work on that, our main point is to have firm commitments. So as long as we can have a free and open debate as long as we have firm commitments. I will do this, and this is what happens if I don't do this. And if we have firm commitments around gas importation, if we go that route, or accelerating renewable energy goals, or fair competition within renewable energy RFPs and such, the commitments have to be firm, or no matter how transparent the discussion is, if the commitments aren't firm, you can talk and tell, say I'm going to do this, that, and the other, but if it's not firm, it really doesn't mean anything at the end of the day. So we need to have, with all of these principles that we've been talking about for if we were to do gas, this is the way to do it, those commitments, whatever they are, have to be rock solid firm, and there have to be penalties attached to them if that agreement is sort of violated in the way that we do this. So whether it's the merger or just the gas question, you really need to have firm commitments for it to mean anything.
And John, last question to you. Commitments, agreements, action, policy, state policy, firm. What role, you're a former commissioner of the PUC. I have to ask you, what role do you think the PUC should play in firming this up?
The LNG question itself, it'd be hard for them to reach out and do anything without an application before them, like the gas company is. I don't think they've submitted anything yet on this most recent, but deciding an issue like that would definitely be within their kuleana, but I think reaching out and trying to make the policy without an application for them would be awkward, because it might not all be electricity generation. It could be used for other things. So I think that has to come from either higher up, the governor. I guess he stated his preference, and I guess DBED Energy Office is more of a state energy policy umbrella. But the enforcement and accountability mechanisms aren't with that either. So the PUC can do what's before them and I guess make statements, but the bottom line, I think, would rest higher up.
Very valuable.
For an overall picture.
Valuable discussion, gentlemen. Thank you very much. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Murray. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thanks for
We'll
having
be
us.
doing some more of this next week. more about LNG and its role in reaching 100% renewables by 2045, as opposed to 2035. Thank you, everyone.